So my name is Father Nick Austin, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second in this year's Father Martin Darcy SJ Memorial Lectures here at Campion Hall in Oxford. A very warm welcome to those of you in person and also to those of you joining us from around the world. Also welcome to our co-sponsors, Georgetown University Press, who are publishing the Darcy Lectures as a series, beginning with last year's by Dr. Patrick Reardon on the common good. As I mentioned last lecture, Campion Hall is celebrating this year 125 years in the University of Oxford. And the Martin Darcy Lectures were established in 1976 as a way of bringing the best of Jesuit scholarship in a variety of different disciplines to a wider audience. It's particularly worthy of note this year that about 40 years after Jack Marney delivered his groundbreaking Darcy Lectures on the making of moral theology, we also have Jim Keenan here in the discipline of theological ethics. We've been very struck by the responses to last week's lecture on grief. Who knew that theological ethics could be this engaging? So if you haven't seen last week's lecture yet, it is available on our YouTube page, or you can get the link from the website. We'll have time for questions, so please do, those of you who are online, enter your questions in the chat as we go along. And those in person are also welcome to pose their questions. And Jim has also provided a very helpful outline of today's lecture along with bibliography that's available in the link in the chat, but it's also available on the website. So Jim, we're looking forward very much to your second lecture on vulnerability.
Thank you. I began these lectures proposing that grief provides an epiphany of human connectedness. There I suggested two very different sites: the biblical historical gathering of the disciples in the upper room for the death of Jesus, from the death of Jesus to the birth of the church at Pentecost, and the fairly common gathering of Christians as they accompany their loved ones to the place of rest at a Christian funeral. Both are places where the reality of death intersects with Christian hope, and neither is compromised, though they remain together, true and present. I want to begin this lecture with another site, and just so you know, I intend to be building on one after another as blocks these lectures. This second one builds very much on the previous one, so I recommend that if you like this and are following it and not heard the grief one, you may want to check that out. I want to begin here, though, with this other site. Christian iconography helps us to understand further grief and therein vulnerability. I propose we think here of Mary Magdalene. A variety of depictions of Mary appear of her, for instance, at the deposition, or later in the garden, or even later in life, where she appears as a contemplative. In each and all, she grieves. Many of us can think of the frescoes and paintings of the grieving Magdalene, attempting to clutch Christ in the Noli Me Tangere, an icon that captures, I think, Christian grief. But we can also think of her as the contemplative, for instance, in The Penitent Magdalene by Caravaggio, where again she grieves. The poet Richard Crenshaw dedicated a poem to her and called it St. Mary Magdalene, or The Weeper. There he describes her eyes as two faithful fountains, two walking baths, two weeping motions, portable and compendious oceans. Taking her cue from Crenshaw, the writer Susan Haskins similarly dedicates her longest chapter to the Weeper in her work, Mary Magdalene, Myth and Metaphor. I would like to stay with the Magdalene, but look on her at the foot of the cross, standing with Mary and John as Jesus is dying. In the iconography at Golgotha, I think we get an epiphany of true human vulnerability as we gaze on the three grieving but present to Jesus and present to us as they witness the death of the Savior. I think there, in that icon, we see that Christian hope is born on Golgotha, precisely in their vigilance in the face of death. As if at the brink of Bonhoeffer's gap, they are at once in their grief, their presence, and their vulnerability, the icon of what we understand to be Christian hope. And by standing and witnessing to his death, by accompanying Jesus, hope is born. Please note clearly, Christ crucified is a sufficient icon of our salvation. We can think of how often the cross or Christ crucified invariably embodies the faith of Christians. Still, Christ crucified with the Magdalene, Mary and John in accompaniment, captures not only our desires to be present with Jesus as he dies for us, but also models for us how we too can stand and witness to the actual kenosis of Christ. As they hear the lament of Christ, my God, why have you forsaken me?" They know, as we know, that this is a lament of abandonment transfigured into one of deliverance. As we contemplate that they hear those words as we gaze on the entire composition, we too enter into that mystery where kenosis is irrevocably witnessed, where we move from the brink of despair to the brink of hope. In that self-emptying, we stand in grief, recognizing that our hope is in that body on that cross, and we contemplatively enter into the moment in salvation history in which death continues to have its say. But Christian hope is born as the three witnesses are, in their exhaustion, inevitably transfigured into Christian history by their accompaniment. That particular composition captures, I think, Christian vulnerability. The vulnerability that I see there is not so much in the wounds of Jesus as in the connectedness of the four actors. In this lecture, it will be that connectedness that we have with one another that conveys our vulnerability to one another. Here, hopefully, you now see that through the honest embrace of grief, whether at Golgotha or at the death of a loved one, therein we encounter love, and in that love find Christian hope. Attending to grief allows us to encounter the gap, sense the impact of death on human vulnerability, but in that honest presence, by staying there, we experience Christian hope by being present. We are called to join in that vulnerability, not only because it is in our nature, not only because we are made in the image of the vulnerable one, but also because it is the key to our destiny. We are meant to be connected. As we now move to consider human vulnerability, this introduction serves, I hope, as a bridge between what we have already considered and what now, in the eyes of faith, we see as the source of our hope, the human as fully canonically vulnerable. So vulnerability. In order to start my investigation, I want to lead you into a consideration that I expect to share with you in these next 3 lectures. My thesis in this talk is that in preparation for the moral life, vulnerability and recognition are necessary preconditions even before conscience comes into play. Let me then share with you an ongoing discovery. Years ago, I became worried about teaching and conscience formation. It seemed to me that we were designing ethics courses as if students just needed a number of instructions to form their consciences. I began to see that we were thinking of conscience as a disposition, as something the students had that we wanted to form. Now I am beginning to think that conscience is not a disposition, but actually follows from some other disposition. Interestingly, Thomas Aquinas held the same position. As we will see, for him, conscience was not a faculty or even a habit, but rather an act, that is, something that we needed to do. I say this because while I teach courses in ethics, say, for instance, about HIV and AIDS and public health, my students learn a lot about the matter, but not all are responsive to it. In fact, in general, I see some students at my university who are responsive to the need for moral assistance, and others not at all. If all have consciences, why do some respond and others do not? Moreover, what if they all take courses on conscience formation? Why is it that afterwards some respond to the need for moral assistance and others still do not? Indeed, failing to respond in the first place seems to be the predominant form of moral failure even in the Bible. People do not fail in the Bible by responding. Rather, they fail beforehand. They fail to bother to respond and therein fail morally. The priest and the Levite pass by the man on the road in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10. The goats do not see the hungry and the naked in the Last Judgment in Matthew 25. The rich man Dives steps over Lazarus in Luke 16. None of them respond. It is not that they do something wrong, it's rather that they do nothing. They do not seem to even notice. Is there something then that starts the ball rolling? Is there something about preparing for the moral life that precedes the act of conscience? Is there something we are not forming that eventually gets one to stop and recognize the need to respond in the first place? This is the question that has guided me to these lectures. I think the problem is that we think of the beginning of moral action as a given, the conscience. But I now believe that the beginning of moral action is first being vulnerably disposed to the other, and then subsequently recognizing the other. And then can we, in conscience, act. In other words, I think there are two steps before acting in conscience: being vulnerably disposed and then actually recognizing. These are the preconditions of the conscience act. What the students lack is not knowledge, but vulnerability, a call to responsiveness, a call to be answerable. Let us return to the Good Samaritan parable. Neither the priest nor the Levite were vulnerably disposed to the injured man, and therefore neither gave him the recognition that he was injured and in need. On the other hand, the Good Samaritan's recognition of the injured man gives evidence of his vulnerability to the wounded man. Then after he recognized the man as being in need, he, in conscience, went about considering the details of what he needed to do in conscience. Acting in conscience, he needed to address a wide array of matters that his conscience had to consider: assess the man's condition, clean the wounds, get him to a safe place, make inquiries about the appropriate place in which to leave him and with an appropriate innkeeper, negotiate and secure from the innkeeper his oversight of the injured man, dispense with his funds, redesign his return to this particular inn so as to take the man with him, etc. The Good Samaritan's conscience got a workout, but the work of his conscience only began after his vulnerable disposition recognized the man in the first place. The recognition led then to the conscience question: now, what do I do? One reason why we do not see what precedes the conscience is because, disregarding Thomas Aquinas, we think of conscience as essentially both a faculty or a disposition and an act. We think of conscience as something one has and as something one does. I know I did, but I do not anymore. I think something else precedes the act of conscience. In the Summa, Thomas wrote that the conscience was not a faculty or a habit, but simply an act. He writes that in the Summa Theologiae Pars Prima, question 79, article 13. According to him, when we act in conscience, we try to descend into the particulars to consider what we should do. In the Summa, in a later question, that article, the one prior to the one on conscience, Thomas asked about a closely related aspect of the moral life called synderesis. There he argued that synderesis is a habit that inclines us to the good and murmurs at evil. This initial habit is for Thomas what eventually launches the act of conscience. Thomas first notes that the human's act of reasoning, he calls it a kind of movement. Then on this idea of movement, he writes, there is a special natural habit which we call synderesis, when synderesis is said to incite to good and to murmur at evil, inasmuch as through first principles we proceed to discover and judge of what we have discovered. This prompting to discover is akin, I think, to recognition. I think this notion of synderesis that incites to good and to murmur at evil resonates very much with what we will see shortly about vulnerability and its prompting that leads us to discover, which is, as I say, akin to recognition. Like Thomas, I want to argue that something precedes conscience that inclines us toward recognizing the neighbor. Thomas called this inclination synderesis. I want to explore what that something is in different, more contemporary terminology, like vulnerability, so that we can better educate our students. Returning to this first movement, then, what the goats, the rich man, the priest, and the Levite have in common is that they were not vulnerable to and therefore did not recognize the other. That is, the homeless and the naked, poor Lazarus and the wounded stranger. If they had been responsive and recognized exactly these persons as such, then they would have needed in conscience to figure out what that other person needed. I believe that these instances of overlooking others happens precisely because these agents were not incited or prompted to see the others as like them. In that same moment, they and their cultures gave them permission not to be bothered by the others or by their situation. Lacking the vulnerable disposition and the habit of recognizing these people, they passed them by. Before moving on, let us acknowledge that assuredly, like my smart but non-responsive students, they know ethics. Certainly, the priest and the Levite did, but they only knew ethical conduct for those whose dignity they recognized. The priest and the Levite for their colleagues, Dives for his business partners. But they are not interested in ethics for those whom they do not recognize, for those who are, in a word, as Butler would say, ungrievable. They practice ethics with selective bias. If they had recognized them as worthy, then they would think in conscience about what they needed to do. What we have to address is their particular indifference arising from their lack of vulnerability and recognition. We need to tap their vulnerability and then train them to recognize others beyond family, friends, and caste. In this lecture, I want to focus on vulnerability. In the next, I turn to the matter of recognition. So vulnerability as foundational. Like many others, when I first thought of vulnerability, I considered it singularly as being wounded, as primarily a condition that raises in others alarm and concern. From the writings of the philosopher Judith Butler, among others, however, I began to see vulnerability as less about being wounded and more about being responsive. When I recognized that the word vulnerable does not mean having been wounded, but rather being able to be wounded, then I began to see how it means being exposed to the other. In this sense, vulnerability is the human condition that allows me to hear, encounter, receive, or respond to the other, even to the point of being injured. Thus, at Golgotha, the vulnerability I see from Mary, John, and the Magdalene is in their capacious responsiveness to the death of Jesus, or to the dying of Jesus. As Charles Matthews writes, vulnerability seems better understood as a description of our openness than our woundableness, the way we are porous to what is not self. Being human is being vulnerable, and as such, being vulnerable should not be reduced to being precarious, that is, to being in an unstable or risky situation, where the possibility or the continuation of harm occurs. Butler realizes that too many people think of vulnerability as primarily being precarious or in an unstable context. She rather wants us to understand that all of us as human beings are vulnerable to one another. When one is at risk, however, she describes them as in precarity. She notes, precarity exposes our sociality, the fragile and necessary dimensions of our interdependency. Butler's move is very important. In a very fine book, The Ethics of Vulnerability, a feminist analysis of social life and practice, Erin C. Gielson considers the implications of a reductively negative view of vulnerability as being in need or being precarious. She argues rightly that if vulnerability is only the object of concern and not the very condition for responsiveness, then when we are in precarity, we would inevitably be looking for moral responsiveness from someone who is anything but vulnerable. That is, those who occupy the role of the invulnerable one. In fact, she advertises her book as a corrective to the discourse. This is on the dust jacket. The meaning of vulnerability is commonly taken for granted, and it is assumed that vulnerability is almost exclusively negative, equated with weakness, dependency, powerlessness, deficiency, and passivity. This reductively negative view leads to problematic implications, imperiling ethical responsiveness to vulnerability, and so prevents the concept from possessing the normative value many theorists wish it to have. When vulnerability is regarded as weakness, and concomitantly invulnerability is prized, attentiveness to one's own vulnerability and ethical response to vulnerable others remain out of reach goals. Retrieving vulnerability as capacious and responsive allows us to see that it is precisely in the Good Samaritan parable that the Samaritan is the vulnerable one to the wounded man lying on the road. Certainly, in being vulnerable, we have the capacity to encounter and respond to another whose life is precarious, as also in the prodigal son parable, where the younger son's own precarity is evident. But while the beginning of that parable focuses on the younger brother, the center of that parable emerges as we recognize the vulnerability of the father, who recognizes his son in the distance, embraces him, reincorporates him, and works to restore all that was unstable, threatened, exposed, and jeopardized. Like the vulnerable Good Samaritan, the vulnerable father recognizes his son as the precarious one, having a humanity not recognized by those who left him to eat with the pigs. Butler insists on how fundamentally foundational vulnerability is. She writes, "Ethical obligation not only depends upon our vulnerability to the claims of others, but establishes us as creatures who are fundamentally defined by that ethical relation. Vulnerability is what defines and establishes us as capable of being moral among one another. As such, our vulnerability precedes everything else that we can say about ourselves." Again, emphasizing the priority of vulnerability, Butler contends, quote, "This ethical relation is not a virtue that I have or exercise. It is prior to any individual sense of self. It is not as discrete individuals that we honor this ethical relation. I am already bound to you, and this is what it means to be the self I am, receptive to you in ways that I cannot fully predict or control." She acknowledges that our vulnerability is woundable and adds, quote, "This is also clearly the condition of my injurability as well, and in this way my answerability and my injurability are bound up with one another. In other words, you may frighten me and threaten me, but my obligation to you must remain firm. I am answerable to you, and therefore I am injurable, or as I would prefer to say, woundable." Vulnerability essentially is what most qualifies ourselves as being bound to and among others, and this, we shall see, is what prompts our recognition of the other. But that act of recognition reciprocates and affirms our vulnerability. Butler returns to the priority of vulnerability with this notion that I am already bound to you, that is prior even to the moan from another in need. She writes, "You call upon me, and I answer. But if I answer, it was only because I was already answerable. That is, this susceptibility and vulnerability constitutes me at the most fundamental level, and is there, we might say, prior to any deliberate decision to answer the call. In other words, one has to be already capable of receiving the call before actually answering it. In this sense, ethical responsibility presupposes ethical responsiveness. Our vulnerability is our answerability. Like Cinderace's, it incites and prompts us to recognize, to respond, to communicate, in short, to love. With a former student of mine, Jennifer Lamson Scribner, dedicated half of a chapter of her recently defended, 2 weeks ago, dissertation on a theological approach to addiction, to how the ontology of relationality in Butler sets the trajectory for moral responsibility. She writes, it's always good to quote a newly minted dissertation, especially in a hall like Campion Hall. For Butler, vulnerability is constitutive of the ontological precondition that allows for the emergence of responsibility. Butler revises the meaning of responsibility by seizing on our limitations. In her estimation, she's quoting now Butler, to take responsibility for oneself is to avow the limits of any self-understanding and to establish these limits not only as a condition for the subject, but as the predicament of the human community. Instead of conceiving of responsibility as concomitant with our freedom, Butler tethers responsibility to vulnerability. By tethering responsibility to vulnerability, we will together in the third and fourth lectures examine both recognition and conscience from that foundational primal point of departure of moral agency, which as prior to the self is constitutively relational and connected. One of the first places that vulnerability as foundational in theology appears is in 2005 in the Irish moral theologian Enda McDonough's book, Vulnerable to the Holy in Faith, Morality, and Act. McDonough began his treatment on vulnerability not with the human, but with God. God reveals to us God's self as vulnerable by the very act of creation in which God lets the light be, life be, nature be, animal life and human life be. McDonough adds, this is a God who lets go and takes risk. Noteworthy, McDonough sees in Mary's reply to the Annunciation, be it done to me according to thy word, another moment of risk, of letting go, that at once engages the divine initiative. He considers basically the riskiness of the creation extends into the incarnation. Implicit in this, then, is the assumption that if God is vulnerable, then we in God's image are made vulnerable. In all this vulnerability, there is great risk. God takes risk in all that God does because God is vulnerable, and God's vulnerability informs our own. Similarities to McDonough's claims can be found in a variety of other works of theology. Before the discourse on vulnerability developed, in fact, before it was even articulated, Abraham Heschel wrote about a divine sympathy in his work on prophets and divine pathos. This sympathy captures in these divine sensibilities of vulnerability that the prophets tangibly breathe when they echo the voice of God. Heschel writes, an analysis of prophetic utterance shows that the fundamental experience of the prophet is a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos, a communion with the divine consciousness, which comes about through the prophet's reflection of and participation in the divine pathos. The typical prophetic state of mind is one of being taken up into the heart of the divine pathos. Sympathy is the prophet's answer to inspiration, the correlative to revelation. Heschel adds, prophetic sympathy is a response to transcendent sensibility. The emotional experience of the prophet becomes the focal point for the prophet's understanding of God. He lives not only his personal life, but also the life of God. The prophet hears God's voice and feels his heart. He tries to impart the pathos of the message together with its logos. As an imparter, his soul overflows, speaking as he does out of the fullness of his sympathy. Vulnerable to the voice of God, the prophet receives the sensibility of that voice, and in the very reception encounters and discovers the capacity to express the sympathy of God. Like the prophets, we too can be like those at Golgotha, who breathed with Jesus up until his last. When we are vulnerable to the holy, we tap into that divine self-expression of sympathetic responsiveness. though not theology, T.H. White's wonderful The Once and Future King provides another account of creation that captures vulnerability beautifully. The narrative goes like this. I figured something light at this point in the lecture. On the sixth day of creation, God gathers all the embryos of each and every species of animal life that God has created. These embryos are rolling all over the place, and they all look like one another. But God offers each species embryo the opportunity to ask for an addition that will distinguish each their own species. One after another takes God's offer up. The giraffe embryo gets a long neck to eat tree food. The porcupine asks for quills for protection. And so it goes for the entire animal kingdom. The last embryo is the human, Adam, who, when asked by God what Adam wants, responds, "I think that you made me in the shape which I now have for reasons best known to yourselves, and that it would be rude to change. I will stay a defenseless embryo all my life." God is delighted and lets the human embryo have no particular protection, to be the most vulnerable of all newborns, and says, "As for you, Adam, you will look like an embryo till they bury you." Behind White's imaginative portrayal of creation is his remarkable vision of the human embryo as the bearer of human vulnerability. By positing the human as willing to remain vulnerable, White is able to disclose further God's delight in that the human now is capable of being in God's image, precisely because of the decision to stay as a defenseless embryo all my life. White concludes his account with God revealing to the human, quote, "Adam, eternally undeveloped, you will always remain potential in our image, able to see some of our sorrows and to feel some of our joys. We are partly sorry for you, Adam, but partly hopeful." Creation narratives help us to see the vulnerability of humanity from the nakedness of Adam in Genesis to the creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But I have always been struck by a passage in the 10th book of Paradise Lost, where John Milton describes how the Son of God encounters the nakedness of our first parents. Milton, by putting the Son of God in the garden, becomes the one who clothes our first parents in the garden. Milton emphasizes that the one who clothes them is the one who will disrobe himself at the Last Supper to wash our feet. And therein begins the process of our salvation, which ends with him hanging naked from the cross. In becoming vulnerably responsive to and for us, Milton teaches us how we are connected. He writes, "Then pitying how they stood before him naked to the air, that now must suffer change, disdained not to begin, thenceforth the form of servant to assume, as when he washed his servant's feet, so now, as father of his family, he clad their nakedness with skins of beast." But then Milton adds that he dresses not only their outward nakedness, but their inward nakedness as well with the robe of righteousness. Nor he their outward only with skins of beast, but inward nakedness much more opprobrious, with this robe of righteousness arraying covered from his Father's sight. In their precarity, they are restored by his vulnerability. So as to conclude on vulnerability as foundational, I would like to return to the Good Samaritan parable again. There's an inversion in the parable that many times we forget until the parable is told again, and then we recall it. It's like a trigger. Remember, the parable is told in answer to the scribe's question, "Who is my neighbor?" A question prompted by the confirmation of the command to love one's neighbor. Naturally, as it begins, we think that the wounded man is the neighbor. But the neighborliness of the Samaritan is so overwhelming that by the end, we agree with the scribe that the neighbor is the one who shows mercy. Jesus teaches us, understanding of neighbor. The neighbor has gone from being an object of concern to being a responsive agent or subject. In a similar inversion, the concept of vulnerability in contemporary literature has moved from the wounded one to the responsive one. The inversion about vulnerability mirrors the inversion of our understanding of neighbor. It redeems the notion of vulnerability from being something to avoid to be something to express. So vulnerability going forward. Here I raise some issues, questions, and also some avenues of hope. Much of the contemporary discourse on vulnerability is indebted to Emmanuel Levinas for his appreciation of the human condition of recognizing the other. McDonough acknowledges, as does the renowned Belgian ethicist who brought Levinas into Catholic moral theology, Roger Bourgaroff at Leuven. In a new work by the Australian ethicist Daniel Fleming, we find an excellent summary of Levinas's contribution. Finally, the American philosopher Judith Butler gives an extraordinary rendition of Levinas's contribution in her giving an account of oneself. It is Butler, as Gilson acknowledges, who has truly developed an ethics of vulnerability. In her own work, she recognizes how fundamentally prior vulnerability is, a point similar to the precedence that Levinas gave it. Vulnerability precedes everything about being human. In theological language, the priority of vulnerability is precisely that ground on which the imago rests and from which it emanates. The divine enters the human through vulnerability, just as for Heschel, the divine sensibilities, it what makes us in God's image. Or another way, the covenant which binds us to God is as vulnerable as the bonds that bind us to one another. Our vulnerability is what keeps us connected. It is how we are connected. Still, I want to acknowledge that on a variety of instances, in speaking on vulnerability, I have been challenged by the question, is everyone as able to be vulnerable to the other? And should everyone be as vulnerable to the other? Invariably, the critique came from feminist voices. So in Vienna, when I presented a paper on vulnerability and human dignity, I was faced with the critique of Lisa Tessman on burdened virtues, and asked, did I not appreciate that some were less capacious and others were even more burdened than others? I responded that I was very sympathetic with those with less power due to gender, class, race, or caste to respond to those in need, and I invoked Valerie Saving Goldstein's foundational essay. I added, though, that I shared the feminist presuppositions of Butler, Gilson, and others of learning, quote, to be vulnerable, to give due recognition, and to conscientiously respond to those who are so burdened. Last October at Duquesne University, I delivered the annual Holy Spirit lecture on grief and vulnerability, where some of the insights for the first lecture were earlier developed. The Latina theologian Naomi de Anda responded and helpfully introduced the difference between chosen and forced vulnerability. The distinction was wonderfully complex, as she noted how she hated binaries while offering Mary's yes at the Annunciation as a chosen vulnerable response, but adding that Mary was a young woman in occupied lands who, by that yes, would find herself in further places of forced vulnerability. It was here in Campion, however, in 2019, when I gave the Campion lecture, that someone recommended to me afterwards Hilla Hocker's significant essay from 2004, The Fragility of the Moral Self. Reading that essay and beginning to follow her work, I began to see the need to incorporate her work into my argument. No contemporary Catholic theologian follows the work of Butler, Levinas, Ricoeur, and Taylor the way Hilla Hocker does, and she critically incorporates them into her own complex and important theological arguments. In her earlier essay on fragility, Hocker explores both Levinas and Butler and notes what becomes important for the concept of the moral self is that from the ethical perspective of giving an account of oneself, both the narrative and the failure of the narrative are addressed toward the other. Hocker's concern is what do we make of it when all is being determined by the claims of the other. As a corrective, she introduces the significance of narrative in order to fill out the exchange. These narratives, though, require an account not only of the self to others, but of the self to oneself. And those self-reflexive narratives do not, as Hacker wisely remarks, always get resolved. On the contrary, the deeply reflexive narratives highlight that invariably there is no final solution. She writes, thus what is expressed through the medium of narrative is the impossibility of overcoming the tension between speaking and keeping silent, between agency and non-agency, between being oneself and another, between fragility and sovereignty, between forgetting and memory, between life and death. More recently, in her major book, Towards a Critical Political Ethics, Catholic Ethics and Social Challenges, she develops an argument for what she calls vulnerable agency, in which she further develops both Levinas and Butler and incorporates a moral self, now not only in a self-reflexive narrative, but as having moral agency within it. She writes implicitly presupposing that, shaped by vulnerability, we are first answerable. She now adds that our agency subsequently shapes that answerability. She writes, vulnerability encompasses the radical ambiguity of human relations. We do not naturally develop into agents. Rather, we are addressed and shaped by others as potential, actual, or former agents in order to see ourselves as agents, beings who are able to act on one's own account. Vulnerability refers as much to the social constitution of the self as to the general affectability of human beings. In short, she writes, in any action, we take the risk to affect the other and be affected by them, and morally speaking, we aim to affect others and be affected in a positive way. To remedy the overlooking of the self as agent, she integrates a notion of autonomy into this vulnerable context. First, she notes that, quote, Levinas increased the power of the other so far that the response of the self to the other was completely determined by the other. She calls this, with uncanny reserve, a stretch. She adds, instead, the normative analysis of contemporary theological ethics, which is a form of autonomous ethics, so as to determine ultimately which claims the other can make or makes are justified. She concludes, the ethics of vulnerable agency embraces autonomy, but it understands autonomy and reinterprets it, in part as the capacity to be open up to the other, in part as the capability to respond to the other, including in the right to say no to the other's demands or desires. This agency is in a vulnerable context, then takes account of one's freedom and one's burden, but it is still shaped and constituted as moral because it is first vulnerable. Hacker's proposal helps us into making vulnerability, I think, more teachable in theological ethics today. Another significant contribution on vulnerability, which focuses on the social dimensions of vulnerability, comes from Linda Hogan of Trinity College, Dublin. In 2018, in Sarajevo, at the close of the Third International Conference of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, Linda Hogan, the co-chair of that organization, gave the final plenary proposing an ethics of vulnerability for a divided world, describing vulnerability as a way of being, as the ground of our relationality, as a mode of social engagement. She asked, can this existential experience of vulnerability be deployed in the service of a politics that unites rather than divides? This depends on whether this recognition of vulnerability can generate a new kind of conversation about how we act in the world, about our ethical obligations towards each other, about how to oppose the conditions under which some lives are more vulnerable than others. She concludes, mutual dependence, shared vulnerability, these are elements of human experience that have rarely been featured in the ways in which politics is constructed or ethical theories are framed. Indeed, much of our politics and ethics seems to be intent on foreclosing this recognition. And yet shared vulnerability and mutual dependence may be precisely the qualities that have resonance with the individuals and communities worldwide who are struggling to find the grounds for the hope of shared future in a world divided. Along with others, Hogan amply shows how vulnerability could well animate the discourse regarding how we encounter human dignity across the world. Indeed, Hogan herself is one who has offered a significant and hope-filled apology for a human rights discourse animated by the language of human dignity. Insisting that our expectations ought to be more modest and realistic, she suggests in her work, Keeping Faith with Human Rights, that human rights discourse can amply support our work to achieve greater equity. For her, vulnerability, human dignity, and human rights are mutually engaging and illuminating. Finally, as I was leaving Boston just 8 days ago to come here, I received Carolina Montero's 510-page Vulnerabilidad hacia una ética más humana that was published in Madrid this year. So I just want to name that and give a shout out. And let me conclude on the virtue of vulnerability. I'm known for writing on virtue, and it is here that I would like in these lectures to begin incorporating them along the way. So what I ask you is what is the virtue of vulnerability? I would like to suggest humility, a redemptive humility, a humility burdened not with self-deprecation, but rather with an unabashed self-understanding of being called to moral responsiveness in God's world. A humble vulnerability helps us to see our interrelatedness that incites us to mutual recognition, where we see ourselves constituted as connected, interdependent, and responsive in the further realization of human dignity. Throughout the scriptures, we discover a humble vulnerability that, like Mary as she sings the Magnificat, recognizes her place in God's world. Humility keeps us grounded, inasmuch as the word humility derives from humus, meaning soil or dirt. Humility keeps us close to the moral terrain in which we find ourselves. A humble vulnerability keeps us alert to our environment, our neighbor in need, our own responsibilities, and the need to take account of ourselves, the future, and its challenges. Finally, humility affects not only how we understand our place in God's world, but also how we think, learn, and understand. This insight into a humble way of thinking that rejects the imperial ego is complemented by what other theologians call the grace of self-doubt. I love bringing that up at university campuses. The grace of self-doubt. This should be given with the degree. In humility, we discover, because it needs to be added on. In humility, we discover that there can be a real grace in doubting ourselves and our opinions. This grace animates and informs our humility and helps us to see that the work of realizing ourselves as disciples of Christ is a formidable lifelong task, fraught with misconceptions and yet possible precisely because of that humility. The foundational stance of humility as the virtue for all Christians is found in Augustine. He writes in letter 118 that the way to seek abiding truth consists first of humility, second of humility, and third of humility. It is not that there are no other precepts to be mentioned, but unless humility precedes, accompanies, and follows whatever we do, unless it is a goal on which we keep our eye, a companion at our side, and a yoke upon our neck, Augustine writes, we will find that we have done little good to rejoice in. Pride will have bereft us of everything. For Augustine, humility is the way of the vulnerable Christ, and therefore the way of the disciple. Humility is the foundation of all virtues, inasmuch as the first virtue for those with faith, hope, and charity. By humility, we live in all three. Let me conclude now by returning to the prodigal son parable. Earlier, I highlighted the father's vulnerability and the youngest son's own precarity. Together, they present a good way of appreciating both concepts. In the beginning of that parable, we encounter the younger brother's rapid decline into precarity, but the center of the parable turns to and focuses on the vulnerable father who has originally given his son his inheritance, but who welcomes his son's return. The same father remains vulnerable to his oldest son as well, who does not suffer from precarity, but from resentment. Let us not think, however, that the father is surprised by the older son's resentment. When he sees his younger son in the distance, the father knows that his movement toward his younger son will trigger the older son's own insecurities. The father's vulnerability frees him to anchor both sons in his household and in their relationships. The stability of the story is the vulnerable father, as the precarious son returns and the resentful one tries to leave. The centrality of the story is the enduringly vigilant, attentive, responsive, indeed humble father, who is so because he is vulnerable and therein capable of responding to them in their own respective needs for one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for another very engaging lecture that blends narrative, human experience, theological argument in a way that's deeply resonant for all of us, I think. So now we have some time for questions, both for those here in person, and if you have questions, continue to post them online if you're watching online. If I could begin, Jim, I was very struck by the move to humility at the end, and this traditional idea that humility is the sort of the gateway, the first of the virtues without which any other virtue will not be received, will not grow. I suppose my question is, what's the difference here between vulnerability as a sort of fact of anthropology and vulnerability as a virtue in ethics? The difference between vulnerability in first nature, one might say, and vulnerability as second nature, because that binary between chosen and forced vulnerability seems to leave out the kind of given vulnerability of being human.
Yeah, I want to talk about vulnerability as a human condition. I'm interested in this notion of prior, what's prior to conscience. One of the reasons why I like humility and that Augustine chose humility is he has it prior to all other virtues. There's something that he's trying to get to that begins everything. Thomas gives us synderesis to get to that prior to all things. So this notion of prior is what I was looking for. If I'm doing the building blocks for preparing for the moral life, what is the first block? That's what I'm asking. So last lecture was on griefs to raise up this issue of our connectedness, but vulnerability expresses the condition about being connected. That there's a way, Butler actually talks about this ontologically. She talks about the nature of the human is constituted as being vulnerable, and that this vulnerability is a responsiveness, what she calls this answerability prior to any. Occasionally, when I use the notion of forced vulnerability, that was coming from Naomi Danda and from others who are not really using, if you will, Butler's approach to vulnerability. When Butler uses vulnerability, she's not using it as a virtue or as an adjective. She's using it as the human condition that we have to recognize as being the point of departure and the point of possibility for human and moral responsiveness. So that's where I prefer to go, but invariably, because so many people write on very different notions of vulnerability, this other issue of, say, forced versus chosen vulnerability is a subsequent expression of vulnerability, whether it's generously yielded or prompted away. So, but it still is rooted in this prior notion of vulnerability. Nobody I know of really uses it as an adjective or as a virtue. At best, it's a condition or as an extension of that ontological capacity of the human.
Okay, thank you.
Graham, you had, oh, sorry.
I really like that exploration of the prior and the prior to conscience and the relationship between vulnerability and responsiveness, vulnerability and recognition. What I want to ask is what is the significance of Christ in this? Other than as an example, because people like Levinas, who had a very theistic zone, which is why the I becomes accused to the point where I can see that could be seen as abusive. Butler has no need, neither does Nussbaum. What is Christ? Because this life of virtue, this vulnerability, it seems to me is so key to spiritual formation.
Right.
So what is Christ doing in this?
Lecture 5.
All right, okay.
So what I'm trying to do is the first 4 lectures are the basic philosophical building blocks for preparing for the moral life. Then I want to put it into a specifically Christian context. So the 5th lecture is called Discipleship. The 6th lecture is called Grace and Sin. The 7th lecture is Virtues and Beatitudes. And the 8th is still being formed, but it's going to have something to deal with mercy in the world church. But what I'm, yes, but come back for the 5th lecture. And as a matter of fact, it's the lecture that I'm finishing these days right now. And that's very much in mind as to not only, I'm not really interested in the exemplar, I'm more interested in how Christ transforms us into recognizing that vulnerability and empowering us toward that vulnerability. In a way, though, in order to give you a foresight of that, I began the lecture with Golgotha, and that Mary, the Magdalene, and John standing there on Golgotha are inviting us to be witnesses to the vulnerability of Christ and to their own vulnerability being engaged in a responsive way by accompaniment. Nick and I are having these big conversations of how accompaniment is a real sign of the possibility or the expression of hope in situations like that. And in my last lecture, I kept talking about Bonhoeffer and the gap that we have to honor when death occurs, and how by standing at the gap, we actually stand in hope. So I was trying to bridge those two. So Christ is very much here, but he's going to be the subject of the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th lectures.
Thank you.
Joe, and then, you should do this. I'll
Yes, sure.
yield, sorry.
We'll have one from Carl first. Yep.
Thank you for the lecture. You mentioned that there is a kind of vulnerability in God's interactions with humanity. You mentioned Mary's, for example, yes, to his Paul. I was wondering, if we follow the axiom that the economic trinity is the immanent trinity, could we speak of a certain vulnerability within God's own Trinitarian life? Something that, along the lines of what Balthasar, for example, says.
So I have a doctoral student who's doing his dissertation on that question. And in our sacramentary, I don't know if it's the same sacramentary that you have, but for the second Eucharistic prayer, the picture is of Christ crucified, the dove above him, but God the Father in a papal tiara. It is the power of God, the power of God delivering the vulnerable Christ. He wants to do his dissertation on, I believe in a vulnerable Father. He wants to say what would happen to our liturgy if we were to extend the notion of vulnerability that we're able to recognize in the Father, in the Son, as being also, at least in the Father. And rather than that the Father is one who looks like a powerful Pope delivering the Son, he may be the vulnerable one who is present and accompanied the death of his Son the way his friends, the friends of his Son did. So I'm very interested in this question. His name is Federico Chinocca. He's from Milan, And whenever he starts talking about this, people get really anxious because they want a very, very powerful God. In fact, here, my first day here, somebody asked, what was I doing? And I said something on vulnerability, and they said, oh, you mean as a person in need? I said, no, as a person responsive. And they said, like where? And I said, divine vulnerability. And they said, you mean God? Vulnerable God? No, 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 no. And walked away. So I realized that this question is a capacious one.
Yeah. It may be worth noting that there's a very impressive, very large painting of the Throne of Grace at Campion Hall. And there the Father is holding the dead body of Christ. And it's a very different image of Christ. Almost like Mary traditionally holding a Pieta, Mary holding the body of Christ. This is a vulnerable Father portrayed.
In my department, when in my department, when because they're watching, and I'm talking about the it's called the Education Policy Committee, which approves dissertation proposals that are drafted between the committee and the student. There was great scrutiny about this student's thesis. And they were really very, very anxious about it. And he had to keep insisting what he wanted to do. So it's not something that is simply a question that people in the pews are anxious about, quite a number of people. And they don't understand that vulnerability is not weakness. It's this responsiveness, this capacity to respond. That's what's so convincing, I think, here.
Good. We'll have a question from online here.
And there's questions over here.
Sure, there's questions over here as well. We'll get back to those. Martin Pendergast, could Jim comment on the treatment of conscience in Amoris Laetitia by Pope Francis in terms of the predisposition to the reality of vulnerability, seeing the reality before acting in or forming conscience?
Boy, I want to say that the fourth lecture is conscience. I mean, I spend a whole 50 minutes on conscience and its connection to vulnerability and recognition. And I don't think you can get to conscience until you do some work on recognition. So Martin, I'd like to pause on that. I'll answer it in 2 weeks.
Okay. Father Frank Turner.
Thank you very much, Jim. I want to link back to the level of the general culture rather than, in this case, Christ. Considering vulnerability as the human condition, there's quite a big path to take to the recognition, the awareness of vulnerability. And I wonder if you comment about what the antithesis of that, a cultural move towards the repression of vulnerability.
Right.
In technocracy, in colonialism, in very widespread movements in the contemporary world.
So this way I can do some advertisement for my next lecture, because I look at Axel Honneth, I look at now Hilla Haka, and also Judith Butler, on each of them, who are anxious about misrecognition or a censorship. But I also go back to previous Niebuhr's work on moral man and immoral society, or something more recent by Isabel Wilkerson on race and caste in the United States, where in all of these, the most interesting stuff I find, but it goes back to Niebuhr, the question of how our social ethos inhibits us from that recognition that we're called to. Black Lives Matter is an eruption against, in the United States, the racist, white supremacist culture that keeps us from recognizing that black men should not be shot in the street for a parking violation. But that there had to be this eruption of recognition, but we need to appreciate that there is a social culture there that accommodates our reluctance to that recognition, or even inhibits it. I don't want to say, and I'm going to say something about the critical realism also next lecture and the subsequent one, though I'm not fully, in that school. I do think that we have to come to terms with those ways, and therefore we have to be looking at vulnerability socially and not just personally. So that balance that I tried to achieve in the last lecture on grief, of both being personal and social, I'm interested in that being personal and social when talking about vulnerability, and being personal and social when talking about recognition. And I will do that on conscience, and I will do that on sin, and on grace. But I do think that that Catholic insight of the both and the personal and social is not evaporated by those critical realists who want to say that it is only the personal who has agency. Societies have agency. Institutions may not have agency, but societies do. Today is my sister's birthday. I'm wearing the tie she gave me. This is because I'm a Keenan. It's not simply because I'm Jim. There are things within me that are constituted because I belong to a family. We cannot simply demarcate that societies are socially institutional. They're not. They're flesh and blood, and they're deeply connected to us. And this notion of the social we have to attend to much more critically than some people are trying to persuade us otherwise. So I'm very interested in this, but that's what we'll be doing all next week.
Good. Joe?
Thank you, Jim. Just hopefully a quick question, maybe not easy to answer now, but if we think of virtues as sort of a moderation of a deficiency and excess of something, how might we frame or think about vulnerability or humility as sort of a moderation of a deficiency and an excess? What are the polarities we're avoiding?
Well, I actually love the Magnificat. I think it's a great hymn. It's the hymn Mary understands her place in God's world. She sees that some are going to be torn down and others are going to be raised up. It's not everybody's going to be torn down or everybody. She sees she's in the middle. She's in the middle of God's world. And I think that that's what I look for in humility. I mean, self-deprecation I don't think of as humility. And that may be too much humility. Too little humility may be somebody who's trying to say that I want to be confident. And I see this as humble. And I'm like, there could be a little bit more modesty there, and I think you could move a little bit more to the center. So I do think that humility has two extremes. I think Augustine is right to see that there are two extremes at every virtue. The one thing that he does say about charity is that charity has no extreme for too much. You can never love God as much more than than is possible. But of all the other virtues, he says that it's a mean between extreme, and I think that humility is there. It's identifying humility. When I was my first episode of teaching was in a second grade CCD. I was a high school student, and I was trying to teach virtues. I was 16, and I was teaching virtue. Little did I know what I would end up doing the rest of my life. And I was trying to teach what is a humble answer. And I always want concreteness. I want to see people do the concrete. So I had all these kids, and I said, you've just pitched a great game. It's just a really great game. And somebody says that you just did a fabulous job. Congratulations. What's the humble response? All the hands get up and says, it wasn't me, it was the team. I said, but you pitched the game. The pitcher is the one who won the game there. So they were commenting on your pitching. And so these hands went down. And then another one said, it was a team effort. And I said, well, this is really very nice, but what about the pitcher, who everybody acknowledges won the game? What's the humble response to this? And they said, they started looking at one another. They were completely flustered. And then they just gave up. And I said, thank you. Just say thank you. Just acknowledge that. And I don't think that it's very hard to get to the center. I think, as a matter of fact, it's easier to get to the center when you do think, as you did, of the two extremes, that you don't go to the exaggeration of one side or the other.
Thank you, Jim. So we'll have two final questions first here. And then
Thank you very much. So, I really enjoyed it. I'd like to come back to the beginning of your lesson and have a question for the scene. You talked about the vulnerability at the foot of the cross. What strikes me really is, as far as I understood, it's not just the vulnerability of Jesus Christ in that scene, but of the other persons around him, the witnesses.
Right.
The witness is a very prominent figure in the trauma discourse, and maybe it's kind of a good role for pastoral care as
Yeah.
well. Could you add a few words to the role of the witness? This first question, and the second one is there a link between vulnerability and empathy?
Yeah. Yeah, and I was playing with that in veiled ways when I was talking about Heschel on the sympathies that were there. But thank you for that question, because I mentioned a few times accompaniment. But what I'm trying to say is that I do think that the presence of the three there is really very, very helpful, as giving us an exemplar. As first giving us a contemplation so that we can enter into it and we can consider the death of the Savior, as we can also consider what vulnerability and hope look like. But we could also see what our role is, and that's what I think your question is. And that's what, like Jennifer Lamson-Scribner in her dissertation was interested in, was the role of accompaniment with those who are suffering from drug addiction. And that somehow that being present, that being a witness, being there, not the solver, but the presence, that's what's called for. Somebody who recognizes what is going on here. And that vulnerability of being present is what may be called for. It's also a humble reply that when you realize that you may not be able to fix it, that doesn't mean you should leave. It means you may have to stay and not be able to fix it. And I think that gives much more integrity to what's developing in these relationships than sometimes alternatives are.
It's not about healing.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that.
The final question from Father Isidorus.
Here. Thank
Yes.
you. Throughout the talk, it was quite clear to me that you used vulnerability as a synonym to receptivity, sensitivity, and so on. And you confirmed 5 minutes ago that you do not use the word vulnerability in the sense of weakness. Now, in ordinary language, we want to distinguish between sensitivity, receptivity, and vulnerability as weakness. So the question is, why do you want to change the meaning, the ordinary meaning of vulnerability? And I'm saying that because I'm reflecting on traditional Christian doctrine and the importance of the story of the fall, where according to Christian doctrine, there is a shift in the human condition from the pre-lapsarian, if you like, receptivity and sensitivity to the post-lapsarian weakness and vulnerability. We find that in the reflection on the human condition of Gregory of Nyssa, who laments the human vulnerability after the fall, and the whole suffering of the cross only makes sense in view of the fall and the redemption of the fall. So I wonder if you still want to keep the vulnerability language distinguished from weakness, whether you have to introduce some new vocabulary to bring in weakness as a consequence of the fall, and how does the fall play in the vulnerability?
Yeah, I think that vulnerability is a range, but I think that its inception, its foundation, its roots, its radicality is in the capacity to be wounded, not being wounded or having been wounded. I think, as a matter of fact, the problem is that people have translated vulnerability into being wounded. It doesn't. It means being able to be wounded. And that is a responsiveness about the human condition that is, I think, captured by that little episode that I gave from T.H. White's book. I've thought about it. It was funny. I gave this lecture in Italian in Milan. We had this big discussion about vulnerability. It means being wounded. And I was trying to explain in Italian that it means being able to be wounded. These are two very different things. And if we have it that you're wounded, then you are weak. Then you are in recovery. Then you are not able to be responsive. And as a matter of fact, and this is the big problem, this is what Gilson, and this is the answer to your question, Aaron Gilson and Butler, they're very concerned that if you're talking about vulnerability as being precarity, being precarious, being the injured one, then the only one that you want help from is the invulnerable one. And the invulnerable one, the dominant one, is precisely not what we're looking for. Your question was about a vulnerable presence who would be able to accompany. I think vulnerability captures that. And I think, and what I find, is in earlier literature, vulnerability is conveyed in that way as well. So there is ways that it is conveyed as having been wounded already. It is been conveyed in that way, but there are also ways that it's conveyed as being able to be wounded, as a state, as a prior state, as a condition by which our risk of being harmed can happen.
Thank you very much, Jim, for another very engaging lecture. Please do join us next week for recognition, and have a very good evening.